In today's video, we'll explore stories of people who came face to face with deadly snakes. From a volunteer handler in Texas bitten during a rattlesnake roundup, to a backpacker in India whose tent became a predator's trap. But first, in a remote palm plantation, a routine day of work would end with him being swallowed alive. It was July 21st, 2016, at a palm tree farm near Palangkaraya in Indonesia. The morning was quiet and humid. The air felt heavy because it had rained the night before. By evening, something terrible would happen that would shock everyone who worked there. Reggie Peters was 32 years old and came from Britain. He worked as a farm advisor, helping to improve the water systems for growing palm trees. People knew him as a quiet man who was good at his job. He liked to walk around the farm by himself, writing down problems in a small notebook. Reggie had been working in Indonesia for 4 months. During this time, he took hundreds of photos of bugs, birds, and animals. He loved learning about all the different creatures that lived around the farm. The workers noticed that Reggie never scared away snakes or lizards. Instead, he would get down on his knees to watch them closely. On that day, Reggie went out to do his regular work. The rainy season was coming soon, so he needed to check the water ditches. If these ditches got blocked, the crops could flood. That morning, he packed his notebook, a measuring tape, and his phone to record notes. Around noon, 2 workers named Amir and Lutfi saw Reggie near a muddy ditch. He was kneeling down and writing in his notebook. They made jokes with him about the huge snakes that local people claimed to see near the water channels. Reggie laughed and said he would love to see one of these big snakes up close. The workers later said he didn't seem worried about their warnings at all. He thought their concerns were just old stories that weren't true. The palm farm was huge, stretching for miles. Rows of palm trees were separated by narrow water channels. The ground was soft and muddy from the recent rain, making some areas very slippery. Small flying insects called dragonflies moved over the water, and mosquitoes filled the air. The only sounds were chainsaws cutting in the distance and frogs making low croaking noises from the ditches. The heat made everything feel still and heavy. Large snakes called reticulated pythons live in this area. They are some of the biggest snakes in the world. They can grow longer than 20 feet and weigh more than 200 pounds. These snakes hunt by hiding and waiting near water for animals like pigs or dogs to come close. Sometimes they even attack people, though this doesn't happen very often. In this part of Indonesia, the snakes have moved closer to where people work because their natural homes have been destroyed. Local people knew to stay away from these snakes, and some carried long knives for protection when working near water. By late afternoon, Reggie still hadn't come back to the camp. Amir started to worry and walked toward the last place where he had seen Reggie. The farm was almost silent, except for the constant buzzing of insects. That's when Amir saw something that made him freeze with fear. One of Reggie's boots was stuck in the mud near the water channel. A few feet away, there was an enormous python lying in a coil. The snake's middle section was hugely swollen, as if it had eaten a very large animal. Amir stood completely still, then started shouting for Lutfi and the other workers. Within a few minutes, 5 men were standing there, watching the snake as it slowly began moving toward the bushes. The swollen middle part dragged heavily on the ground, leaving a deep track in the mud. The workers grabbed sticks and long poles, trying to poke at the snake from far away. The python made a loud hissing sound and opened its mouth wide, showing its curved teeth. It coiled up to defend itself. The snake was massive, reaching about 15 feet long. None of the workers were brave enough to get close to it. The farm supervisor arrived and immediately called the local police. While they waited, the men kept watching the snake carefully. At one point, the swollen belly seemed to shift slightly, as if something inside had moved. One worker noticed a broad, uneven bulge pressing against the snake's skin, a shape too large and irregular to be a pig or dog. The men stepped back, horrified by what they were seeing. When night came quickly to the farm, they brought flashlights to keep watch. When the police arrived, they decided they had to kill the python. It took several minutes and many people hitting the snake with long knives and poles before it finally stopped moving. The workers stood quietly as police and local villagers prepared to cut open the snake's belly. The process was slow and disturbing. As the knife cut through the pale belly scales, mud and fluid mixed together on the ground. Inside the snake was Reggie's body, curled up and covered in a layer of slime. His clothes were soaked and torn. One of the workers recorded what happened on his phone. The video started spreading through local messaging groups that night before being quietly removed. Reggie's notebook and phone were damaged by moisture, but were found near the edge of the water channel, covered in mud. His body was placed in a sealed coffin and taken to Palangkaraya before being flown back to Britain. The farm management quietly put up new warning signs near the water channels, telling workers not to travel alone. The following week, Reggie's cabin was cleaned out and his belongings were shipped home to his family. The plantation incident was over, but it left people shaken. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in India, another dangerous encounter was about to happen. It was March 15, 2014, at Ranthambore National Park in Rajasthan, India. The air was cool and quiet after a very hot day. The camping area had turned off all its lights hours earlier, so everything was dark except for some moonlight. Inside one of the canvas tents, two travelers were sleeping. They didn't know that a snake had quietly crawled under the tent entrance. Claire Johnson was 26 years old and came from Melbourne, Australia. She worked as a graphic designer but had quit her job to travel around Asia for a whole year. She had been saving money for almost 2 years to pay for this trip. She wanted to see as much of the world as possible before going back to work full-time. Claire's friends back home knew her as someone who liked adventure, but was also careful. She always looked up information about the places she stayed, carried medical supplies with her, and wrote a detailed blog so her family could follow her travels. Visiting Ranthambore was something she had really wanted to do. She had always dreamed of taking photos of wild tigers. That day, she had gone on a safari tour and was excited because she got to see a female tiger near a waterhole, even though it was far away. She was staying at a cheap eco-camp outside the park gates. She was sharing a tent with Laura, a German student she had met on the train from Jaipur. The camp was basic but clean, with tents that had zippers and were built on raised wooden platforms. Claire was very neat about keeping their tent organized. Every night she would shake out her shoes and make sure the tent entrance was zipped up properly. That evening was cool for March, so she zipped the canvas door all the way closed before they went to bed, leaving only a small opening for fresh air. The camp was located next to dry grassland where thorny acacia trees and tall grass created areas of shade. At night, insects made buzzing and clicking sounds, and sometimes they could hear peacocks calling in the distance. The ground around the tents was hard dirt covered with leaves and small rocks. This kind of environment was perfect for small reptiles that hunted during the cool hours before sunrise. Spectacled cobras are common snakes in Rajasthan. You can recognize them by the circular pattern on the back of their hood when they spread it out. These snakes usually stay away from people, but in early morning they sometimes come into human areas looking for mice or rats to eat, or seeking warmth. Adult cobras can grow up to 6 feet long and have poison that affects the nervous system. This poison is strong enough to kill a person within hours if they don't get proper medical treatment. Local tour guides always warn campers to check their bedding and shake out their clothes before sleeping, because snakes sometimes crawl inside without being noticed. That night, sometime after 4 in the morning, Laura woke up to a soft rustling sound near the bottom of the tent. She was still half asleep when she grabbed her phone and turned on its flashlight. The light beam showed something that made her freeze with fear. A spectacled cobra was coiled up just a few inches away from Claire's sleeping bag. The snake had its head raised slightly. Before Laura could do anything, Claire moved in her sleep and stretched out her leg. Her bare ankle touched the snake's body. The cobra bit her twice very quickly, putting both fangs into the soft skin just above her heel. The bites happened so fast that Laura almost didn't see what occurred until Claire suddenly moved and made a gasping sound. Laura screamed, which woke up everyone in the camp. Claire sat up and grabbed her ankle, where 2 small holes from the snake's teeth could be seen. Camp workers ran to their tent carrying flashlights. They could see the snake as it crawled out of the tent. Claire's breathing became fast and shallow, and people who saw her said her eyes looked strange and glassy. When she tried to stand up, her legs gave way as if they couldn't hold her up anymore. Her voice was very quiet when she said her legs felt like jelly before she fell back down onto her sleeping mat. The camp didn't have any anti-venom medicine to treat snake bites, so the staff put Claire in a jeep to drive her to the hospital. Laura went with her and pressed a scarf above the bite marks to try to slow down the spread of the poison through Claire's body. The drive to the nearest hospital took more than 40 minutes on bumpy roads. Halfway to the hospital, Claire stopped responding when people talked to her. Her skin became pale and felt cold and damp. When they finally reached the small rural clinic, the medical staff told them there was nothing they could do to save her. Claire's body was taken to Jaipur later that day. Her parents were contacted through the Australian embassy. They asked for her body to be cremated following the local customs. The camp management decided not to close down their business, but they hired a local snake expert who started giving weekly talks to new guests. These talks taught people how to check their tents properly and where to keep lights on at night to avoid problems with snakes. Laura eventually went back to Germany, but she later wrote a detailed story about what happened on a travel website. Her story warned other backpackers to always check their tents, bedding, and shoes when staying in areas where snakes might be present. This post was shared quietly for years as a serious reminder to travelers who thought sleeping close to nature was romantic without understanding the real dangers. This incident shows how important it is for travelers to take safety precautions seriously when staying in wilderness areas. Even experienced and careful travelers like Claire can face unexpected dangers when wild animals and humans share the same spaces. The tragedy serves as a reminder that proper preparation and awareness can be life-saving when traveling in remote natural areas. But sometimes, preparation isn't just for travelers. Even those who live and work in wild areas face risks every single day. For them, nature isn't a destination, but part of their routine, which makes danger harder to avoid. The next story shows how a normal workday can turn deadly in an instant. It was September 9th, 2015. In a small lime orchard outside a rural town near Veracruz, Mexico. Jorge Cruz was 42 years old and had worked in this lime orchard his whole life. He got up before sunrise every day to check the water systems, cut tree branches, and teach his oldest son how to tell if the fruit was healthy or sick. People in the village knew Jorge as someone they could count on. He was the type of person who would fix broken carts for his neighbors and lend them tools without expecting anything back. Jorge had a habit from when he was a child. He liked to work without shoes. He said this helped him feel the ground better and move faster when he had to climb the lower tree branches. The afternoon was very hot, and the air felt heavy. The sun beat down on the leaves so hard that nothing seemed to move. This orchard had belonged to the same family for many years. On this particular day, the normal work routine would be interrupted by something that changed everything in just one moment. Jorge was working with two neighbors, Raul and Mateo. They were picking limes on the far side of the grove where workers had made a pile of cut tree branches after cleaning the area recently. The three men were making jokes about how hot it was as they moved between the low tree branches, putting bunches of limes into bags. Jorge was wearing his wide hat pushed back on his head and an old faded shirt. He reached for a low branch and shifted his weight to pull the fruit closer to him. The ground in the orchard was hard dirt covered with cut leaves and thin roots. The pile of cut branches provided cool shade for mice, rats, and small reptiles. There was a patch of wild plants that marked the edge of the orchard, and the low treetops made long shadows that moved across the ground. It was very quiet, so small sounds like fruit falling to the ground or clothes rubbing against tree bark were easy to hear. The men were focused on their work and conversation, not paying attention to potential dangers around them. A type of poisonous snake called the Terciopelo, Bothrops asper, locally known as the nauyaka, lives in Central America. These snakes are thick-bodied and usually grow to be 3 to 5 feet long. They have very dangerous poison that destroys skin and muscle, causes severe bleeding in the area where they bite, and can affect blood clotting and blood pressure throughout the body. These snakes blend in perfectly with fallen leaves and often stay completely still until someone steps close to them. When they bite someone, it usually causes extreme pain and the area swells up very quickly. That morning, neighbors had been talking about seeing more snakes since the recent rains. Jorge's wife had told him to wear boots while cleaning brush and debris. The pile of cut branches where they were working was a temporary heap of trimmings, exactly the kind of place where snakes like to hide. Raul later said he had warned Jorge to be careful, but Jorge waved off their concerns and said he would work quickly. When Jorge shifted his position, the snake attack happened instantly. The fer-de-lance burst out from the leaves and bit the skin just above his ankle. Raul and Mateo heard Jorge make a short, sharp cry of pain and saw him pull his foot back while grabbing at the wound. Before the other men could react, the snake bit him a second time. Dark blood spotted the dirt where his foot had been. The pain hit Jorge immediately and was very severe. He bent over double and dropped the fruit he was holding. Within just a few minutes, his lower leg began to swell and the skin started to look bruised and discolored. He began throwing up and sweating heavily, and his face became very pale. Raul quickly tied a piece of cloth above the bite marks, and they kept Jorge's leg still by making a splint from a broom handle. A neighbor brought a small wooden cart, and they lifted Jorge into it, then pushed the cart toward the dirt road that led back to the village. The trip to the clinic was bumpy and slow. Dust covered Jorge's damp skin, and he became confused, speaking in broken words and going in and out of consciousness. At the small village clinic, a nurse looked at his swollen leg and noticed that his pulse was weak and his blood pressure was low. The clinic had basic medical supplies but no anti-venom, the special medicine needed to treat snake bites. The staff used their radio to call the regional health center asking for help, but the nearest supply of anti-venom and a properly equipped ambulance was hours away. Jorge's condition got worse. He became more and more disoriented, and his breathing became shallow. The medical staff could not help him get better. By evening, Jorge had died at the clinic despite their efforts to stop the bleeding and help him breathe. Raul said they tried to kill the snake, but it disappeared into the thick plants. Jorge's flip phone and work notebook were found and returned to his family, though they were stained. In the weeks that followed, A traveling veterinarian came to the village. He brought a small supply of anti-venom and taught basic training to local people who could respond to emergencies. He showed them how to make splints from available materials, how to apply pressure bandages, and explained when not to use tourniquets. The villagers cleaned up and clearly marked the brush pile area. They put up a simple pole marker where Jorge had been bitten. His wife began wearing his wide-brimmed hat during harvest times, a visible reminder of his absence. The lime trees continued to produce fruit, and from that time forward, each harvest season began with a brief, serious reminder to all workers about being careful and staying safe. Jorge's death was a wake-up call for his entire village, proof that danger could strike in the most familiar places. But such risks aren't limited to farms or dusty orchards. In many parts of the world, rivers, lakes, and swimming holes carry their own hidden threats, waiting just beneath the surface. It was May 2nd, 2018, when the air over the Cross River felt heavy and still. Mina Balogan was 19 years old and had just returned from university 1 week earlier. She spent most of her afternoons at the river. People knew Mina for her lively personality. She often brought her cousins to swim with her, even though the older people in the village warned them that snakes were more active during the dry season. Mina didn't think their warnings were important. She believed that nothing dangerous ever happened in the shallow water. On this day, she convinced 4 of her cousins to join her for a swim. They left their sandals and shirts on the rocks before walking into the cool water. Mina had plans to go back to school soon. She talked about wanting to start a small community project when she returned, something that would teach younger children how to swim safely. She had always thought of the river as a place full of life, not danger. Because Mina felt so comfortable in the water, her cousins trusted her and followed her without worry. The afternoon was the kind where every sound seemed to carry far. The river's surface looked calm and reflected the cloudless sky, but local people often said the water was never truly quiet. Something was always moving underneath. The part of the river they chose was wide and shallow, with muddy banks that fishermen liked to use. The air was humid, and dragonflies flew just above the water's surface. Even though it was a bright day, the thick plants on the other side of the river made long shadows over the deeper parts of the water. African rock pythons are the biggest snakes on the continent. They can grow to be more than 20 feet long. These snakes hunt by staying very still until an animal comes close. Then they bite with powerful jaws before wrapping their body around their prey to squeeze it until it stops breathing. While attacks on people are rare, these snakes are known to catch and eat goats, dogs, and even large animals like antelopes. During the dry season, they often hunt near water sources that are getting smaller because that's where animals come to drink. Earlier that week, an older fisherman had warned Mina's uncle that he had seen a very large python lying in the sun on a log nearby. Children had been told not to swim until the rains came and made the water levels higher, but Mina insisted that the shallow bend where they swam was safe. Mina had been in the water for almost an hour, playing and floating on her back, when one of her cousins saw something long and dark moving toward them. At first, they thought it was just a tree branch caught in the current, but when it curved and moved silently across the water's surface, fear spread through the group of children. The shape moved forward quickly, showing the patterned body of an enormous python. The snake attacked with shocking speed. Its jaws locked onto Mina's side before its body wrapped around her. Her cousin screamed as the snake's coils got tighter, forcing the air out of her lungs. The water became violent and choppy as Mina fought against the snake, then went still as the python dragged her into deeper water. The children ran as fast as they could back to the village, screaming for help. It took several minutes for the men to grab their long knives and run to the river. By the time they got to the river bend, the snake was still moving around in the water but had pulled Mina deeper under. The men went into the water and cut at the python over and over until it finally let her go. When they pulled her onto the muddy riverbank, she had clearly been underwater for several minutes. Her skin was cold and pale, and her lips were a deep blue color. The villagers tried pressing on her chest and blowing air into her mouth, while others stood back in shocked silence. When they pressed on her chest, water came out of her mouth and nose, and mixed with the mud under her head. Someone recorded the desperate scene with a phone. The sound of shouting and rushing water mixed with the noise of long knives hitting the snake's body. Their efforts continued for several minutes, but there was no sign that she was breathing. Mina's body was placed on a mat near the water as the villagers gathered in silence. For weeks afterward, the river bend remained empty. Fishermen refused to throw their nets there, calling the area cursed. The village learned that even familiar places could hide unexpected dangers, especially during times when wild animals were more likely to come near human areas looking for water and food. Mina's dream of teaching children to swim safely took on new meaning as the community worked to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. While some dangers hide in the wild, others hide in places humans control. Even with experience, underestimating an animal's speed, strength, or venom can turn an ordinary day deadly. It was June 10th, 2013, in Sweetwater, Texas. The fairground was extremely hot under a clear sky. Heat rose off the tarps and metal bleachers, turning what should have been a routine demonstration into a day where small mistakes would have serious consequences. Samuel "Sammy" Price was 38 years old and had been a volunteer snake handler at the annual rattlesnake roundup since he was a child. He did repair work around town and showed up every year to handle snakes for visitors. People respected him because he was steady and had years of practical experience. He taught new volunteers and preferred to show them hands-on rather than just talk about it. He believed that experience could help reduce danger. Local people trusted Sammy because he rarely rushed his work and would correct sloppy technique without making a big deal about it. This year, the festival had attracted a bigger crowd than usual, and the organizers had made the schedule tighter. Sammy had moved between snake pits all morning, answering questions from visitors and spending a lot of time in the sun. He had skipped eating a full breakfast to keep the demonstrations running smoothly, and he felt lightheaded. He thought this was just from the heat and being tired. His co-workers told him to rest and drink water, and he nodded in agreement but kept working. When someone asked him to do one more live demonstration that afternoon, he said yes, because he saw it as part of his responsibility. The roundup used shallow pits for displaying snakes. These pits were surrounded by temporary barriers, with a raised platform for the announcer and folding chairs for people to sit and watch. The smells of fried food and car exhaust mixed with dust in the air. There were shade cloths and water containers near the pits, but the layout was cramped and kept volunteers in the sun. People watching leaned against the fence with their phones held up high, recording every movement. The setup was designed so everyone could see clearly, but this reduced the space for handlers to move around and limited opportunities for both people and animals to cool down. Western diamondback rattlesnakes are strong pit vipers that are commonly 4 to 5 feet long. Their poison causes tissue damage and bleeding, and can trigger shock throughout the body if someone receives a large dose. Large adult snakes can strike with surprising reach. When under stress, a snake may twist in unexpected ways, changing how a handler is gripping it and exposing unprotected skin. Even skilled handlers can get bitten when a snake is already upset, or when heat and repeated handling increase its stress level. Earlier that day, organizers had warned volunteers about taking turns and limiting heavy snake handling during the hottest part of the day. A small accident in a morning demonstration had prompted them to formally remind everyone to take breaks and drink water. Medical personnel were standing by with IV fluids and anti-venom available on site. Sammy heard the instructions and agreed with them, but the crowd and the busy schedule drew him back to work. He took a heavy western diamondback snake from a colleague and stepped into the pit wearing a leather glove and carrying a snake hook. He lifted the snake using a practiced motion. For a moment, the crowd relaxed because Sammy's steady presence made onlookers feel calmer. Then the snake's body shifted under stress and twisted sharply. It lunged forward, and its fangs went through the soft tissue near Sammy's elbow. Pain shot through his arm. He signaled that he was okay, but his face became red, and sweat formed on his forehead. For several minutes, he kept talking to the crowd, but his breathing grew shallow and he asked for a chair. The bite area swelled quickly, and discoloration appeared, spreading down his forearm. Within minutes, the swelling moved past his elbow toward the shoulder, the skin darkening with mottled bruising as tissue damage progressed. Volunteers moved him to the first aid tent once it was clear he could no longer stand. Paramedics applied pressure to slow the spread of venom, started IV fluids, and pushed the first vials of antivenom. His breathing turned shallow, his skin cold and blotched with bruising. Despite fast treatment, his blood pressure collapsed, and his pulse faded. Witnesses later recalled the frantic attempts to keep him conscious, as medics called for an airlift that never came in time. Friends and fellow handlers organized training sessions after the event. They invited regional medics to review emergency procedures and practice drills. A younger relative of Sammy's began helping at the pits, learning to prioritize taking turns and staying hydrated over putting on a good show. The festival board documented the incident and created a checklist for demonstrations, maximum handling time, required breaks, and a fast evacuation plan to the nearest ambulance access point. Thanks for tuning in. If you're ready, the next story is waiting on the end screen, another encounter with the unexpected on Animal Quest.